Have you ever believed in something so completely, until one moment shattered that certainty and rebuilt it into something divine? Maestro Lorenzo Benedetti used to believe he had heard every sound a human heart could produce. From the deep cathedrals of Rome to the grand basilicas of Paris, he had spent 4 decades conducting choirs that echoed through marble and history. But nothing could have prepared him for what he heard one humid morning inside a tiny church in the heart of the Philippines. It's strange, isn't it, how the world often assumes that holiness resides only in the old, the grand, the European. They say Rome holds the sacred sound, Vienna holds the genius. But the Philippines? The world rarely speaks its name in the same breath. They're passionate, some might say politely, but not refined. It's an invisible insult, whispered as if agreed upon long ago, that true artistry, true divinity, cannot be found in places that still tremble under the weight of poverty or storms. And yet, one of the most respected men in the Vatican, Lorenzo Benedetti himself, would soon stand before the world and whisper something that made even the cardinals fall silent. I heard heaven, and it was in the Philippines. The story of how that moment came to be doesn't begin with light, it begins with loss. 3 years before his trip, Maestro Benedetti had lost his wife, Elena, to cancer. For months he had tried to conduct music that no longer sang to him. Every hymn sounded hollow, every chorus lifeless. He had buried himself in work, convinced that discipline could drown grief. But even the halls of St. Peter's Basilica felt empty. He once confessed to a colleague, "I can hear voices sing, but I can no longer hear God." It was Pope Francis himself who noticed the change. "Lorenzo," he said gently one evening after Mass, "you have given your life to sacred music. But sacred music is not born in Rome. It is born in hearts that still believe." Those words struck something dormant in him, though he did not yet understand them. Weeks later, a letter arrived on his desk, an invitation from the Archdiocese of Cebu. They were hosting a choral congress and requested that the Vatican send a master conductor to mentor local choirs. Lorenzo had declined such invitations before, but this one carried a handwritten note at the bottom. "Perhaps the song you've been searching for is waiting here." He almost ignored it. But something, perhaps restlessness, perhaps faith's faint whisper, made him say yes. And so, one early dawn, Maestro Benedetti left Rome for the first time in years, not as a teacher, not as a believer, but as a man trying to remember what heaven sounded like. The Philippines greeted him not with gold cathedrals or marble pillars, but with warmth, the kind that feels human, not holy. At the airport, a young choir from a nearby parish had gathered to welcome him. They were barefoot, their robes mismatched, their smiles too wide for formality. And when they sang, their voices were raw, untrained, uneven, but sincere. Something in their sound felt alive, almost defiant against the world's quiet cruelty. But Lorenzo, ever the perfectionist, only nodded politely. "They have heart," he said softly to his assistant. "But heart alone is not heaven." He did not know that heaven was listening. That night, in his small hotel room overlooking the rain-streaked streets of Cebu, he couldn't sleep. He kept hearing echoes, children laughing through thunder, a jeepney driver humming a hymn as he fixed his tire in the rain, a woman praying softly in the next room. It was not music. It was life itself, layered with faith, unpolished yet sacred. He scribbled in his notebook, almost unconsciously, "They sing without knowing they're singing." The next morning, as he traveled to a remote province to visit a local choir, something happened that would change him forever. The van broke down outside a small town called Lobak, Bohol, a place he had never heard of. While the driver repaired the engine, Lorenzo decided to walk toward the faint sound of music drifting through the humid air. It was coming from a small, time-worn church by the river. Inside, a group of children were rehearsing, their teacher tapping rhythm with an old stick. No instruments, no sheet music, just voices. They sang Ave Maria in Visayan accent, clear, unpretentious, painfully beautiful. And when they reached the final note, something in the air shifted. The echo didn't fade. It expanded, as if the walls themselves were singing back. Lorenzo stood there, motionless. For the first time in years, tears filled his eyes. He felt something he couldn't explain, a vibration deeper than sound, a silence louder than applause. He whispered, This is heaven." Later, when asked by journalists why he said that, Lorenzo only smiled. "Because for the first time since my wife died, I heard God again, and he spoke in a Filipino accent." Before the Philippines, there was silence. For nearly 3 years after Elena's passing, Lorenzo Benedetti had lived in a kind of spiritual exile, though he never left Rome. His mornings began in the echoing corridors of the Vatican, where marble floors reflected the tired shuffle of priests and tourists alike. His life, once filled with music, had become a museum of echoes, each rehearsal another reminder of what he'd lost. He directed the Vatican Choir as if on autopilot, his hands tracing the air with perfect precision but no pulse. To the outside world, he was still the great maestro, the genius who had shaped generations of voices. But to himself, he was just an old man who had forgotten what it meant to feel. "You cannot conduct heaven if you no longer believe in it," he once muttered under his breath after a failed rehearsal. His voice breaking in the empty basilica. The truth was, he had grown disillusioned not just with grief, but with the church itself. Not the faith, never the faith, but the noise that surrounded it. Endless bureaucracy, pride disguised as devotion, the performance of holiness without the presence of it. He had watched choristers care more about perfection than prayer, about applause more than adoration. Somewhere along the way, sacred music had become theater. He tried to fix it. He traveled to Vienna, where the choirs still sang with mathematical precision, to Paris, where the voices soared but hearts seemed absent, and to New York, where even the grandest cathedrals felt like concert halls for the rich. Everywhere he went, he searched for a sound that could reach beyond talent, a sound that could resurrect the faith he had lost. But all he found was more noise. In one particularly bitter moment, during a rehearsal in Salzburg, a young soprano asked him, "Maestro, what exactly do you want us to feel when we sing?" He looked at her, exhausted. "Nothing," he said. "Feeling makes you weak. Sing the notes correctly, and that will be enough." But that night, as he lay in bed, her question echoed back to him. "What exactly do you want us to feel?" He realized he no longer knew. It was around that time that his health began to falter. The doctors said it was stress. His blood pressure spiked, his hearing dulled at the edges, his hands trembled slightly when he lifted the baton. He feared that one day soon he might not hear at all. The idea terrified him, not because of his career, but because of what it meant spiritually. If a man devoted his life to sacred sound, what would remain of him when the sound was gone? So when that invitation from Cebu arrived, written in delicate cursive on cream-colored paper, he felt something stir inside, a whisper, faint but undeniable. "Perhaps the song you've been searching for is waiting here." It sounded absurd. What could possibly be waiting in a distant archipelago thousands of miles from Rome, a country he only knew from news about typhoons and poverty? And yet, the thought refused to leave him. For days, he kept the letter in his pocket, unfolding it every evening like a secret prayer. One night, he took it to the small chapel near his home, the same place he had prayed beside Elena's hospital bed. He sat there, surrounded by flickering candles, and whispered for the first time in years, "Lord, if there is still music in me, show me where to find it." When he finally agreed to go, his colleagues were surprised. "The Philippines?" one priest said. "You'll melt in that heat, Lorenzo." Another laughed. "Those choirs are sweet, yes, but they are not ready for your standards." Lorenzo smiled faintly, saying nothing. He didn't go for standards. He went for silence, to see if God might speak there. The flight from Rome to Manila felt longer than his years. As he looked out the window, clouds drifting over oceans, he wondered if he was chasing a ghost. He was 67, tired, half-deaf in one ear, and burdened by the unspoken guilt of losing faith in the very thing he was meant to defend. But destiny has a strange way of disguising itself. Sometimes it hides in the places the world least expects, among people the world least notices. And when his plane descended over the Philippine Islands, he saw through the window a chain of emerald green surrounded by endless blue, and something deep within him softened. "It looks like the rosary itself," he whispered, tracing the shape of the islands on the glass. He didn't yet know that what waited for him there would change not only his career, but his soul. That in a small church beside a muddy river, far from Rome's marble and majesty, he would soon hear something that would make even the Vatican tremble. For now, he only knew that he was tired. And that, for the first time in years, he was ready to listen again. The air in Cebu was heavy with the scent of rain and sea salt, a mixture that clung to the skin like memory. Lorenzo Benedetti stepped out of the van that first morning with the slow caution of a man expecting disappointment. The archdiocese had arranged a modest welcome. Nothing grand, only a few priests, some seminarians, and a small group of young singers waiting outside the cathedral. They bowed politely, shy smiles lighting their faces, and when they began to sing, it was not a performance, it was a greeting, simple, earnest, unpolished. He listened, not as a conductor this time, but as a man who had forgotten how to feel. The harmonies were uneven, their voices cracked in places, and yet something inside him stirred. There was no vanity, no pretense, only faith carried on breath. It wasn't perfect, but it was alive. Later that day, he was taken to a local school where he would mentor the diocesan choirs. The hall was small, the walls peeling, the fans buzzing loudly overhead. Children sat cross-legged on the floor, clutching photocopied hymns. He watched them, amused. Back in Rome, students often walked in with rehearsed confidence. Here they looked at him with wonder, as if his very presence was a blessing. When rehearsal began, the sound startled him, not for its beauty, but for its fragility. Their timing was off, their tone uneven, yet their eyes shone with devotion. After a while, he stopped them gently. "Do you know," he asked, "why we sing sacred music?" A boy raised his hand timidly. "To make people happy, Father." Lorenzo smiled. "That is good, but it is not the whole truth. We sing because it is our way of speaking to God." The room fell quiet. And then, softly, a young girl said, "Then maybe, sir, we must sing louder, because sometimes he cannot hear us when the storms come." Lorenzo looked at her, speechless. That line, spoken with such childlike sincerity, pierced deeper than any theological argument. He felt his chest tighten, the same ache he once felt when Elena would sing her favorite hymns while washing dishes on Sunday mornings. He turned away quickly, pretending to adjust his notes, but his eyes glistened. Over the next few days, he observed something that unsettled him in the most beautiful way. Everywhere he went, People were singing. Not in cathedrals, but in the streets, in markets, at funerals and baptisms. He heard a mother hum a lullaby to her sick child in a hospital corridor. He saw fishermen in Bohol singing Ave Maria before heading to sea, their voices rising over the waves like a collective prayer. Even jeepney drivers played gospel songs, their passengers singing along between laughter and traffic horns. This, he realized, was not performance. This was communion. In every melody, faith was breathing, resilient, radiant, real. But the true turning point came unexpectedly during his visit to that small riverside church in Lobach. The van had broken down, and while the driver fixed it, Lorenzo followed a faint melody carried by the wind. Inside the church, barefoot children were rehearsing a hymn. Their teacher, an elderly woman with silver hair, was guiding them with nothing but a stick and patience. There was no piano, no organ, no conductor's baton, only hearts beating in unison. When they noticed him standing at the doorway, they stopped, giggling nervously. Lorenzo raised his hand gently. "Please, continue," he said. "Sing as if I'm not here." They began again, and as the sound filled the small chapel, something within him broke open. The simplicity of it, the fragile, trembling purity, felt like sunlight breaking through stained glass. The walls echoed not as stone, but as soul. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, he felt God move through sound, not from the choir loft, but from the ground itself, from the children, from the river outside, from the rain tapping on the roof. When the song ended, silence lingered. It wasn't the kind of silence that followed applause. It was sacred, suspended, alive. He opened his eyes and saw the children looking at him, waiting for approval. He wanted to speak, but no words came. Finally, he whispered, "You have sung what heaven sounds like." The teacher smiled humbly. "No, sir," she said, her voice trembling. "We only sing what we live." That night, as Lorenzo sat alone beside the Lobach River, he felt something unfamiliar, a peace that did not come from perfection, but from presence. The stars reflected on the dark water like scattered candles. He realized that faith, like music, is not about reaching for heaven. It is about recognizing that sometimes heaven reaches for us. And it had found him here in this quiet town at the edge of the world, where songs rose not from training, but from love. The following days unfolded like a quiet miracle. What had begun as a reluctant journey turned into something sacred, intimate, almost confessional. Lorenzo Benedetti no longer kept his distance. Each morning, he walked from the rectory to the church barefoot, letting the damp soil of Bohol stain his white trousers. He would greet the children, sit among them, and listen, not to correct, not to teach, but to absorb. At first, the villagers were shy around him. They had heard of his reputation, the maestro from Rome, the man whose choirs had performed before popes and presidents. But Lorenzo defied their expectations. He did not speak of technique or discipline. He spoke of feeling. "Don't sing to impress me," he told them one morning, standing beneath the swaying palms outside the church. "Sing because you love the one who gave you your voice." The teacher, Senora Ruiz, looked at him in surprise. "But Maestro, you came from the Vatican. You of all people should demand perfection." He smiled faintly. "Perfection belongs to angels. Humanity belongs to us, and God listens to both." Something shifted that day. The rehearsals became lighter, more joyful. The children sang not for approval but for prayer. Their voices lifted like incense, imperfect yet pure. Lorenzo began writing again, pages of reflections, melodies, fragments of faith reborn. In one entry he wrote, "They sing with cracked voices, but I think heaven prefers cracks. It lets the light in. One afternoon, while preparing for Sunday Mass, the village lost power. The electric organ went silent, and panic spread among the children. "We can't sing without accompaniment," they cried. Lorenzo raised his hands. "You have everything you need," he said softly. The power was never in the organ. He began to hum the first note, and slowly, one by one, the children joined him. Their unaccompanied voices filled the dark church like dawn breaking through clouds. He looked around and saw old men wiping tears, mothers clutching rosaries, fishermen still in their wet shirts standing by the doorway, listening as if heaven itself had descended. For the first time in his life, Lorenzo wasn't conducting, he was part of it. His voice trembled as he sang with them, and he realized that what he had searched for in grand cathedrals had always been here, in humility, in shared breath, in faith unbroken by circumstance. That evening, a storm rolled over Bohol. Winds howled. The river swelled, and the power remained out. The villagers gathered inside the church, lighting candles against the darkness. Lorenzo stood among them, holding a candle that flickered with each gust. As thunder roared, the choir began to sing, spontaneously, fearlessly. Their song rose above the storm, a defiance made of faith. Rain drummed on the roof like percussion, wind howled like an ancient organ, and their voices wove through it all, fragile but unyielding. In that moment, Lorenzo felt something extraordinary. The boundary between heaven and earth dissolved. It was as if every voice, every drop of rain, every flash of lightning joined in divine harmony. He closed his eyes, tears running freely down his cheeks. And then he heard it, the sound that had haunted him since Rome, the one he had believed lost forever. It wasn't the human choir anymore. It was something larger, infinite, a resonance beyond hearing. It was as if the universe itself had joined in worship. When the storm finally calmed, no one spoke. The church stood still, wet and candle-lit, the air thick with awe. Lorenzo turned to Señora Ruiz and whispered, "Now I understand. Heaven was never silent. I was." From that night on, everything changed. He stopped wearing his conductor's uniform. He ate with the villagers, shared stories by the river, and prayed with them at dawn. The children called him Lolo Enzo. They taught him Tagalog songs, songs that spoke not of triumph, but of gratitude. And each time he sang with them, he felt the ache in his heart ease, replaced by something fierce and gentle. Hope. Weeks later, as he prepared to return to Rome, the children gathered by the pier to see him off. They sang one last hymn, their voices carrying over the water. He tried to smile, but his throat tightened. He had come to teach music, and they had taught him to hear again. He turned to Señora Ruiz and said quietly, "In Rome, we polish voices until they shine, but here, you polish souls. That's the truer art." She bowed her head humbly. "Maestro, it was never us. It was you who learned to listen." He looked out toward the horizon where the sea met the sky, the same shade of blue he remembered from the stained glass of St. Peter's. "No," he whispered. "It was the Philippines. It was God speaking in another language, one I had forgotten." And for the first time in years, he felt certain that when he returned to the Vatican, he would not be bringing back music. He would be bringing back a miracle. When Lorenzo Benedetti returned to Rome, the bells of St. Peter's Basilica sounded strangely hollow. The grandeur of the Vatican, the marble floors, the echoing choirs, the precision of every note, felt beautiful but empty, like a painting admired too long. He stood before the great altar, listening to the familiar voices of his choir, yet all he could think about was the sound of barefoot children singing under candlelight, while the storm raged outside. The next morning, during rehearsal, he lifted his baton. and froze. The voices around him were perfect, faultless, powerful, but they no longer moved him. The sound of heaven he had found in Bohol was not in technical brilliance, but in unguarded faith. He lowered his hands slowly and said, "Stop." The choir looked confused. "We will begin again," he said, "but this time, don't sing for me. Sing as if God is listening for the first time." At first, they hesitated, but then something shifted. The tone softened, the rhythm loosened, and within minutes, a warmth filled the room. It was imperfect, but human. When the final note lingered, Lorenzo smiled for the first time in years. "Now," he whispered, "you sound alive." Word began to spread within the Vatican. Maestro Benedetti had changed. He spoke often of a remote island church, of children who sang like angels without knowing it, of a people whose faith turned storms into symphonies. At a conference weeks later, a journalist asked him, "Maestro, you've heard the greatest choirs in the world. Where did you hear the sound of heaven?" He paused, looking at the sea of cameras and expectant faces, then said simply, "In the Philippines." There was laughter at first, then silence. Someone asked, "Do you mean the Philippines has the best singers?" He shook his head gently. "No, I mean they have the purest souls. Heaven does not choose where to sing. It chooses who will listen. And in that small town, I learned to listen again." He told them about the night of the storm, about voices that rose above fear, about faith that needed no cathedral. "We in the West build walls of marble to contain our faith," he said, "but in the Philippines, they build faith that can survive without walls." His words spread across Europe, translated and reprinted in Catholic journals and newspapers. Some thought he exaggerated. Others wept reading them. But for Lorenzo, it wasn't about admiration. It was about truth. He began to incorporate Filipino hymns into Vatican liturgy, their lyrics blending Tagalog and Latin. At first, the cardinals were skeptical, but during one service, when a Filipino choir visiting Rome sang Ama Namin, Our Father, in gentle, trembling voices, the entire basilica fell into a reverent silence. Even the Pope closed his eyes, tears streaming down his face. After the Mass, Pope Francis approached Lorenzo and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You went searching for heaven," he said softly, "and brought it back." Lorenzo smiled. "No, Holy Father, heaven was never lost. It was waiting, in the hearts of those we often overlook." In the years that followed, he returned to the Philippines many times. He helped rebuild choirs, donated instruments, trained teachers, but he always said, "I am not giving them anything new. I am only giving back what they gave me, the sound of faith." He was even given a local name by the villagers, Lolo Enzo, the grandfather who heard God in their song. On his 70th birthday, he was invited to conduct a special mass in Manila. Thousands attended, from priests to fishermen. When the choir began to sing, he turned to the congregation and said, "Listen, this is not my music, this is yours. This is what the world must hear." And when they sang Ave Maria, the same song that had first reached him in that riverside church, the vast cathedral seemed to dissolve into light. Years later, long after Lorenzo Benedetti passed away, a plaque was placed inside that small church in Lobak. It read, "Here, a man from the Vatican heard heaven." Tourists still visit, curious about the legend. Some say they too feel something unexplainable when the choir sings. Others just stand in silence, letting the music wash over them, realizing that perhaps heaven does not live above us, but among us. And somewhere, beyond time and distance, you can almost imagine the maestro's voice, calm, aged, certain, saying what he once told his choir in Rome. "Do not search for God in perfection. Search for Him in compassion, in laughter, in the songs sung under broken roofs. That is where heaven hides. Because in the end, that was the miracle He carried home. Not a melody, not a memory, but a revelation. That faith is not measured by grandeur, but by grace. And if you ever doubt that heaven listens, go to the Philippines. You might just hear it sing back.